Secretary Lew appearing before the Financial Services Committee later this morning to address potential threats to U.S. financial stability. The committee maintains that the Fed's low interest rate policy is among those issues, arguing that it introduces dangerous imbalances into financial markets as investors reach for yield. Joining us right now from Capitol Hill is Representative Jeff Hensarling. He's the chairman of the Financial Services Committee. Thank you for joining us this morning.
No, thanks for having me.
I imagine you're gonna grill them on this issue, but the question that I would like to ask you is, when you think about the volatility that you're, I suspect, arguing is a result of the Fed policy, is how much of that is a systemic issue to you, and how much should the government be involved in that?
Well, I think there's a lot of issues that help create some instability potentially in our financial markets, and I think we know it's that we have all investors who are reaching for yield. We know that there are potential asset bubbles within our economy, and what we would hope is that FSOC would recognize that the Federal Reserve probably needs to start looking at a predictable rules-based policy, and that we can't sustain the interest rate policy that we have now. In many respects, a number of learned economists would argue that it was this artificially low interest rate environment that was one of the but-for causes of the housing crisis in the first place. And so we have this FSOC that at least will identify some of the potential instability within the financial markets. They just won't go to the source, and a lot of the source is federal policy. For example, the Volcker rule, leading to all types of illiquidity in our fixed income, our corporate bond market. So when the FSOC is given the direction to identify emerging threats to financial stability and to make recommendations, unless they will source it, you can't do anything about it. It's like the old Pogo cartoon. We've met the enemy and they are us.
I understand looking at rules like the Volcker rule, but I also wonder about politicizing things like the Federal Reserve in terms of how it approaches interest rates. And so are you looking more at when you talk about rules-based issues, is that what you're talking about, or do you actually want there to be a rules-based approach to interest rates?
Well, in the last Congress, the Financial Services Committee passed legislation that would simply make the Federal Reserve less opaque. My reading of economic history, and that of many economists, is that when we have a more predictable rules-based policy that the market understands, the market knows, that's associated with periods of greater economic growth. No, I don't want to politicize the Fed, but given that they have 14-year terms and an independent budget, I'm not sure just how threatened the Fed should feel from the United States Congress. But what we're asking is, come up with any convention, come up with any approach you wish, change it, deviate from it, but come to Congress and testify in open hearing about what you're doing and why you're doing it. The Fed does not have a monopoly on smart PhD economists. If they have a good methodology, it ought to be tested in the court of public opinion, and today it's not.
We want to turn our attention right now to the topic of bailouts. I wrote about it earlier this week, that AIG decision with Hank Greenberg. Wanted to get your views on the court's decision and the implications of the decision. A lot of people, including myself, have suggested that this is going to make it very difficult for the government to pursue a bailout in the future, especially when you tie that decision with Dodd-Frank. Where do you stand on that?
Well, Andrew, one, I'm not a real lawyer. I'm a reform lawyer. I haven't read the court opinion, but I will say this. I do believe that it is that we are dangerously close to really eroding one of our foundational principles, and that is the rule of law. We should not have governance by a chief executive who has a pen and a telephone but doesn't seem to have a copy of the Constitution. So the rule of law should count. So again, I haven't read the opinion, but even in an emergency situation, we have to be governed by the rule of law. Again, it's a foundational principle, one of the sources of our freedom and our economic prosperity.
Sounds like you would support Hank Greenberg, who's effectively suing the government and taxpayers.
Well, as I understand the hearing, and I'll say again, I haven't read the opinion, So as I understand it, there was no monetary gain to be had. No AIG should have been allowed to fail. I think giving creditors 100 cents on the dollar has helped make big banks bigger, small banks fewer, and frankly is ultimately harming economic growth. What I'm saying is that the federal government, without having the rule of law, should not be able to come in and essentially take over a firm. And so if that needs to be done, we have to follow the rule of law. And we're losing the rule of law to the discretion of regulators. And it's one of the reasons that we're mired, I believe, in 1.5% to 2.5% economic growth when we're capable of 3.5%, 4%, maybe 4.5% economic growth. The rule of law must count for something in America.
Congressman, we want to thank you for joining us this morning. Hank Greenberg is appealing that decision, so there's still an opportunity for the taxpayers to pay him a little bit and the debate over the rule of law to continue. Thanks so much.
Thank you.